And when that day was finished, they retired once more to the royal bedroom, Scheherazade and the king. And when the time was right, Dinarzade was sent for, and she came to that room. And she said once again, "O my sister, if you are not sleepy, please tell us the rest of the story of the genies and King Solomon." "Yes, yes," said the king. "Please tell us the rest of that story." And so Scheherazade said, "It has reached my ears, O king, that Dahesh, the genie, when he was looking out from the tower in the citadel of the king of the sea, he looked far and wide, and he said, I saw what was coming towards us. And I called to other genies, and I said, Look, it comes. And they all rose up on their wings, and they looked far off, and we all saw the carpet. A huge, gigantic green carpet, 60 miles across and 60 miles long. It would take a human a week to walk from one end to the other. There were cities on this carpet. There were castles, towers, battlements of all kinds. And King Solomon was in the middle on an alabaster throne trimmed with gold. And on his right side there were 1,000,000 genie warriors. And on his left side there were 1,000,000 human warriors. And behind him were thousands of wild beasts, bears, tigers, alligators, snakes, ferocious animals of all kinds. And above that carpet, flying in the air, there were the birds of the air, hawks, eagles, crows, ravens, shading that carpet from the hot sun with their wings. So this immense cosmic battle machine was coming straight for us across the air. We had churned up the waters of the sea so no boat could get through, but Solomon did not need a boat. He had his carpet. And later I heard about the voyage of this carpet from the land of King Solomon to our own. And I heard how on a certain day it was crossing a wide valley. And as it crossed this valley, there came a voice from down below in the grasses, and the voice said, "Oh, no." And King Solomon heard this voice, and he gave an order, and the whole carpet stopped in the air. And then King Solomon got on the back of a golden eagle, and the eagle flew in spirals down away from that carpet, down and down to the bottom of that valley. And there King Solomon found a dead tree, and under that dead tree there was a stone, and under that stone there was a stick, and under that stick there was a mushroom, and underneath that mushroom there was an ant. And the ant was saying, "Oh, no." And King Solomon said, "My dear ant, what seems to be the trouble?" And the ant said, "King Solomon, I am king of the ants, and I see that great machine you have in the sky there, and I am afraid for my people. For when that carpet lands, millions of my subjects are going to be killed. So that is why I say, oh no." And Solomon said, "My dear king of the ants, do not fear. I promise to you that my flying carpet and my armies will harm no ants at all. No, all of your subjects will be completely preserved. They will be fine. And as a token of the trust between us and this agreement, as a token of my good word, I give you this." And from the folds of his gown, King Solomon pulled a dead dragonfly. And he gave it to the king of the ants. And he said, "Here, share this with your people. And always remember, your kingdom is much greater than mine." And then King Solomon got on the back of that golden eagle, and it flew in spirals back up to that flying carpet, and he gave an order, and it moved forward majestically through the air. So later I heard about the compassion and the mercy that King Solomon was capable of. But on that day I knew only his anger. It was the birds which hit us first. They came shrieking out of the air, the crows, the ravens, the hawks, the eagles. They pecked at our eyes. They flew in through the windows of our castles and our towers. I saw 20 crows lift a horse into the air and then toss it into the sea. We fought back with fire. We beat at them with our wings and our claws. We cast spells of blue lightning, and birds and feathers went showering into ash on the floors of our cities, into the forests there. But then, with the carpet itself, arrived at the island of the king of the sea, and the genies took flight into the air, and the human warriors jumped down into the streets, and the bears and the tigers came. The tigers and the anacondas and the snakes and the alligators were running through our streets. It was chaos. There was shrieking in the air. The beasts were fighting on the ground. The genies were fighting in the air. I saw one genie pummel another into a tower, which shattered and fell down to the streets below. There was fire and smoke. Great cries went up to the heavens above. I thought the earth itself would open up and swallow all of us just to have some silence. It went on for 3 days of smoke and ruin and suffering and hideous combat. And then finally it seemed that King Solomon would carry the day. For he captured the king of the sea himself and took him before him on his carpet in front of his throne there. And I saw that the day was finished, and I took flight, flying through the air from that island. But behind me came Eldimriat, the chief general of all of King Solomon's genies. On wings himself, wings and claws, he came after me through the air, and through the forests and the deserts of this world. Finally, for 3 months we pursued each other, until finally we arrived at the North Pole, and there we squared off on a frozen lake and pummeled each other for 3 days, until finally the ice shattered and I fell into the waters of that place, and I was overcome. And so Eldimriat wrapped me in a magical chain and dragged me back across the earth to King Solomon on his throne in the center of his carpet. And beside King Solomon, in a luminous chair, was Princess Pearl. And King Solomon spoke, and he said, "All of your genie colleagues who have opposed me." And King Solomon spoke, and he said, "All the genies who have opposed me I have trapped inside brass jars, and I have thrown them all into the sea of Kar. But you, my friend, have opposed me in a deep way, and you I sentence to be embedded in a pillar of black stone at the bottom of the sea. You shall remain in that pillar until the end of time. Have you anything to say?" And I looked at King Solomon, and I said, "May you never know true love." And as they dragged me away, I saw the startled eyes of Princess Pearl fill with tears. And they dragged me off and embedded me in this pillar at the bottom of the sea. And 1,000 years later there was a great earthquake, and the earth changed and moved, and all the waters slid north away from this place, and this sea bottom became a great blistering, salty, sandy desert, the one you see now. And so I wait in this pillar, and I shall wait for the eventual day of my release, which will only come when the end of the world arrives. And all that sustains me as I wait is the memory of Princess Pearl, kneeling on the marble stones of the palace garden and whispering to me her desire for true love. Well, they all wept to hear the story Dahesh told. And when they'd had their fill of weeping, they bid him goodbye and set out across the desert. Only the fisherman looked back, and there he could see Dahesh folding his wings over his head and going to sleep. And as before, they saw many beautiful things, many hideous, horrible things. Landscapes of strange rocks. Old statues eaten away by wind and sand. They went on across that desert until finally they reached the Sea of Kar. And on the shore of that sea there was a village, and they spoke with the people in that village, and they said, "Yes, indeed, we find brass jars all the time." And in fact, they'd found one that morning, and there before their eyes they opened it up, and a genie came out, a genie of green smoke. And he said, "Forgive me, Solomon, forgive me, I repent." And he flew up into the heights of the sky and was gone. they spent some time there, the expedition did, by the shore of the Sea of Karkar, until they'd collected 24 brass jars. And then they loaded them up onto their camels, and they set out for home. The day of their return arrived, and they saw the castle of blue stone in the distance, and they returned joyously to that castle, and they went straight away to the well in the courtyard there and drank the clear water from that well. And then they all slept for a long time. In the morning, when they'd cleaned themselves up, they went to the throne room of that castle. And the king was there. And Taliba was there, and the vizier and the fisherman. And then the vizier gave an order, and 24 servants brought in the 24 brass jars. And the vizier gave a great and eloquent speech, describing in brief their journey to the Sea of Karkar and back, across those miles of wasteland and wilderness and blistering desert. And then he took a knife, and he went to the first jar, and he pried off the lid. Pry, pop, and he stood back, and he waited. And they all waited. And nothing happened. Nothing happened at all. And the vizier looked inside the jar, and he saw that it was filled with mud and broken shells. So he went to the next jar, and he took his knife, and he pried at the lid, and he took it off, and stood back. And they all waited. And nothing happened. Nothing happened. So he went from jar to jar. Finally, he opened every one of those 24 jars, and there was no genie to be found in any of those jars. Nothing. No genies at all. The king was furious. He was in a high rage when this was finished. Immediately he gave an order for Taliba to be killed, on the spot. But as soon as he gave the order, no one could find her. They looked around. Where had she gone? That woman in black cloth who'd guided them across the desert, where had she gone? She had vanished. Vanished into the desert, it seemed. Years later, rumors surfaced that in fact she had gone deep into the mountains to lead a life of prayer and contemplation, to look for treasures not of the world, but of the soul. And the vizier, well, the king ordered him banished immediately. So he was tied hand and foot and put on a camel and taken to the edge of the kingdom and left there in the sand. And the fisherman, well, the king didn't know what to do with him. The fisherman who'd started this whole escapade by bringing him the magic fish from the magic lake. Well, the king wasn't sure what to do with him, but he just didn't want to see him ever again, so he had him locked in a dungeon in the basement of the castle. So the fisherman had a hard night in that cell in the dungeon. Darkness all around him. He'd just barely seen his wife and his 2 children. What would happen to him? Would he be killed the next morning? Would he be left to rot in that dungeon forever, to starve his days away? He wasn't sure. He had trouble sleeping. He had horrible dreams. And at one point he awoke. And you know how it is sometimes, perhaps. He awoke and didn't know where he was. Was he in the desert? Was he on the shore? Where was he? So he began crawling through the darkness, crawling forward to find out where he was. And then he hit something, and he put out his hand, and it was a wall. And the wall was made of metal. In fact, it was made of brass. And then he heard a noise, and he looked far above him, and he saw an opening in the ceiling, like the opening of a jar. And as he watched, a great hand took a lid and jammed it down on top of that opening. And the fisherman cried out, "But I'm not a genie!" But it was too late, and the next thing he heard was the sizzling sound of molten lead being poured over that lid. And he awoke in his cell with that sizzling sound in his ears. And he knew he was not in a jar, but in a cell. But in that moment, the two places did not seem any different. So he slept a bit more, and then in the morning, with a jangle of keys, he was awoken, and his door was thrown open. And there was a guard there, and the guard said, "Fisherman, go." And the fisherman said, "What?" And the guard said, "The king says you're free to go. I say hurry before he changes his mind." So the fisherman ran up the stairs out of that dungeon and out into the blinding morning light, and there was his wife and his 2 children. And he took their hands joyfully, and they ran from the castle of blue stone to the ocean's side, and along the shore back to their village, back to their house, back to their own kitchen table. And they landed and sat down at that kitchen table, huffing and puffing, and they laughed until they cried to be back home again. And then his wife pulled from her pocket a bag of gold pieces. It was the bag of gold pieces that he had been given for selling the magic fish to the king. She'd saved it all this time, knowing that at some point it might become useful. And so the fisherman, his wife, and his 2 children lived for many, many years in that house, in that village, in peace and contentment. And sometimes the fisherman would take down a round piece of metal from a shelf, a piece of metal with a 6-pointed star on it. And his children would say, "Daddy, what is that?" And he would say, "My children, this is the lid to a jar that once held a genie." And he would tell them all about his journey to the Sea of Karkar. Well, at this point, Scheherazade stopped speaking, because the morning light was coming in the windows of the royal bedroom. And Dinarzade said, "My sister, what a marvelous and amazing story." "Indeed," said Scheherazade, "and tomorrow, if the king lets me live, I will tell you another story, even more amazing than this." And the king said, "We'll see," as always. But in his heart, as always, he said to himself, "I have to let her live another day, for I have to hear another one of these amazing stories." And so the 3 of them slept for a while, and then they arose to greet the day. Hello, and thank you for listening to this story. If there's one image from the Arabian Nights that is most well known, it would be the genie in the bottle. It is proverbial, as we say, and the way that wonder arises from out of a more or less household object is truly wonderful. And here in this story, we get the history, the backstory behind that, and we learn how those genies got in the bottles in the first place. And it's a spectacular story. I love it for its size, this epic genie battle between King Solomon and the King of the Sea with this gigantic carpet. I have not exaggerated anything in this story. If anything, I've taken things out to make it easier to get, to understand. But all these details are in the original story, that 60-mile long carpet. which is helpful to remember. We're kind of overwhelmed by spectacle, perhaps, these days, especially if you go to the movies, which are more and more marketed towards adolescent boys and girls to some extent. But it's helpful to remember that these old stories that are thousands of years old also had spectacle in them, big, gigantic things. And perhaps that's a need of the soul as well. We need to have our imaginations kind of broadened and expanded by by images like this, like that of the huge carpet, and coupled with the ant, the king of the ants in the valley below, which is a detail I love. So I think this is a story of bigness, of course, and it also shows the variety that is present in the Arabian Nights. The Arabian Nights is obviously not a single story. It's many, many stories, all collected from a variety of places, India, Persia, throughout the Middle East. And here we get an example of that variety because this story is a legend. You know, it's less a fairy tale than a story of something historical about a real person, King Solomon, who is perhaps exaggerated, expanded upon, but he was real at one point, the wise and perfect ruler, King Solomon. The genies in the Arabian Nights are interesting because they are both good and evil. In the West, we've got a lot of evil spirits, and it's kind of our judgment seems to be that if there's a spirit around, it tends to be negative and cruel and angry. That seems to me to be a judgment put on our culture by the church since the Inquisition, because God does magic and humans don't. So if there's magic around, it must be demonic. You can see this. One example of this is Merlin, who in some origin stories has the devil for a father, because that's the only explanation for how he can do these things, because God does magic and he's got to be, if we're doing it in any way, if humans are doing it, we're evil in some way. So in the Nights, it's a little more, there's a more easy traffic between the good and evil sides because genies can be good or evil. Some of them fight on the side of Solomon, some of them fight against him and are evil. So in the stories, just as a storyteller and as a listener, it's great to have these characters bouncing around and tearing up the place for good and for evil, which is very refreshing to us. I was lucky enough to be in Bali one time for a 3-week trip, that island of Indonesia, and it was the first time I'd been outside of the Christian world, and I didn't even conceive of it in that way. I wouldn't have thought of myself as being in the Christian world, but getting there, Bali is intensely Hindu, and there's a lot of practices there which probably predate Hinduism, actually. A lot of gifts given to the spirits, whether they are in trees or in machines like cars or in animals or in water sources. And I saw what we might call magic there. I saw magic sort of practiced. I stayed with a guy named Ketut Lier, a medicine man of that place. Now, of course, I'm using a Native American expression or a European expression for the Native Americans when I describe him. Ketut Lier, a medicine man. That's what his sign, however, said, probably on the street. Probably it was there for the tourists. It said medicine man. And people came to him. I saw people, I would come home at night to stay at his place, and there would be people there from the village, and Ketut would be busy making an amulet for them or a magic drawing. These are the words he used to me to describe these things. Or there would be little ceremonies. I took part in a small little ceremony there. I don't even know exactly what it was about. He told me it was about balancing the male and female energies in all of us, which sounded pretty interesting. But I just felt myself outside of the West. And again, since the Inquisition, those types of things, those personal ways of relating to forces larger than ourselves through ceremony and ritual and magic, what we would call magic, are not really allowed. But in Bali, at least when I was there, it seemed they still were, and they were still believed in and used as viable ways to make good things happen. So I just think of that when I'm talking about this story and looking at the attitude towards magic in it. Because in the Arabian Nights, as I've said, it's sort of magic can be good or bad, and it's less suspect than in the West. So thanks for listening to this, and may this story enlarge our minds and our capacity to dream up big and wild things. Thanks for listening to this podcast. You can send me comments via my website, jayleeming.com. Thanks as always to the Patreon supporters. If you're able to support me through Patreon, please do. That's one way to get these stories out into the world. This podcast wouldn't exist without those folks. So thanks very much, and may we all see the outlines of the stories in which we live. Take care.